to forgive me a little bit. This is my first time moderating a panel, so I am definitely making it up as I go along. But I have an amazing set of panelists with me today. So quick round the table, the virtual table. Would everyone like to introduce themselves? Anne, starting with you, given that you are our room leader for today.
Sorry, I was just sorting out the YouTube.
Sorry, that's a really unfair multitask, isn't it?
Sorry, I'm Anne Corlett. My debut novel, Space Between the Stars, was out a couple of years ago. I also write short fiction sometimes. Haven't done that for a while, it occurs to me. I spent 16 years as a criminal lawyer before I turned to writing, and here I am.
Adrian.
Hi everyone, I'm Adrian Walker. I'm a writer of speculative fiction. I wrote The End of the World Running Club a few years ago and the sequel, The End of the World Survivors Club, and a few other books as well. I also write software and I live up in Aberdeen.
Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike Carey. I also write as M.R. Carey. My post-apocalyptic fiction includes Girl with All the Gifts by On the Bridge, and more recently, The Book of Coley, which is the start of a new trilogy. I also write comics and occasionally screenplays.
Kim.
Hi, I'm Kim Lakin-Smith. I am a writer of science fiction and dark fantasy. I've written books such as Cyber Circus and my new novel Rise. And I tend to concentrate quite a lot on Dust Bowl scenarios and the concept of the other.
Paddy.
Hi, yes, I'm Patrick Edwards. I seem to keep writing books about alienation, not on purpose though. One of them came out in 2019, it's called Ruin's Wake, which is a dystopian fiction inspired by but not based on North Korea. And my second book, Echo Cycle, which is a weird mashup of time travel to ancient Rome and futuristic post-Brexit dystopia. It came out on the 10th of March and was due to have its launch about a week ago, which happened on Twitter. So we're all adapting.
And do we have Dave?
I'm just typing to him frantically. I keep trying to promote him to panelist and it's not working. I think he's going to have to go, if you can hear me, Dave, go back out and come back in via that panelist link that you have rather than the meeting ID. I keep promoting you to panelist, but it's not taking. I keep saying he's going to be joining us as a panelist and it's just not happening. Oh. This is a good start.
This is a real panel. They'd be running around in the audience trying to get up on stage.
Yes, unable to climb past
Yeah.
Somebody fiddling in the background with wires.
You can't get past the bouncers, that's what it is.
I don't know whether he's getting my chat or can hear me. He hasn't been emailing me.
Yes,
There's
first cat.
Bonus panelist.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
No, bonus panelists are always welcome, especially cat-shaped ones. And I will also introduce myself. My name is Anna. I go online by Immeral, and I'm a blogger at There's Always Room for One More. So I feel like I've definitely jumped from one side of the desk to the other, joining the panel as moderator this afternoon, and I'm very excited. Now, should we give Dave another moment or two, or should we dive on in?
I think we're going to need to start, otherwise we're going to start running at low time. I'm going to keep trying to get him. I've sent him a message and hopefully he can hear me. Dave, one more time, if you can hear me, please go leave the meeting and come back in clicking on the panelist link I sent you.
All right, and hopefully in that case we will be joined very shortly with full audio and maybe even video by Dave Hutchinson, who is the author of the Fractured Europe sequence. Now, if we dive on into our first question, these are very, very unusual circumstances we find ourselves in at the moment. Although if we were going to ask whether anyone could have predicted it, I suspect there are a couple of people on this panel who might be on the list to say, yes, actually had a go at that, thanks. So what is it that makes us so keen to write and read about catastrophes? And Mike, you mentioned The Girls with All the Gifts. Why don't you take this one first?
Sure. So I think one of the things that post-apocalyptic fiction can do is it allows us to do a kind of thought experiment. In normal life, in normal everyday life, most of our identity, most of our social identity is mediated through the rules and the expectations of society. We enact roles that are pretty much clearly laid down for us. and we don't often step outside them. Roles in our workplace, in our family units, with our friends, and so on. And I think one of the things that post-apocalyptic stories do is they allow you to put the question, when all of that framework falls away, when all of the restraints of society, all of the controls, and all of the safeguards disappear, what's left? What are we when we're not mediated in that way? What is human nature outside of the constructs that we've created? And there are a very, very wide range of answers to that, ranging from the sort of the brutal and cynical, the sort of Mad Max of it all, to, I think, much more hopeful and positive stories. And I think in both in Girl with All the Gifts and in the Coley sequence, one of the things that I try to explore is the creation of new societies. The way that we immediately, as soon as the breakdown happens, we immediately start to build again, because that's part of human nature, I think.
There's like a tabula rasa kind of opportunity with it all, isn't there? And how it's interesting how in so much of this kind of fiction we don't immediately go feral. I mean, some people do, like The Walking Dead's quite good at depicting certain divergences towards a more feral existence, but most people try and climb onto some kind of structure again. But there's, I guess, the opportunity of doing it from the ground up, which is kind of why I guess it's exciting and people get on board with it.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. What you were saying there, Mike, about that kind of almost like a reset of the status quo. I think a lot of people are drawn to that kind of literature because there's a kind of yearning for a change, and society is such a complex thing at the moment that people can't see how they can affect that change themselves. So to have this kind of enforced, whether it's a violent or an unviolent change to the world, is almost like it's like a get out of jail free card. It gives you an opportunity to just reset everything, like Eddie Izzard calls it the Etch-a-Sketch kind of end of the world, and start again. And that's really exciting for readers and writers, because, like you say, it allows for a whole new set of circumstances, and more importantly, removes all of the dust that we have to sort of wade through in normal life. So I think that's one, like you say, one of the reasons why people are drawn there.
I think that we've existed in this kind of permissive society for so long, and particularly in somewhere like the UK, where we can kind of sweep poverty and suffering under the carpet. And everything has been, to a degree, kind of there at a click of a mouse for us. And I think particularly with teenage fiction, it's been really, really interesting to see the fact that because they've had such a causative existence to a degree, that we've had stories such as The Hunger Games and The Maze Runner, and this sense of needing a Lord of the Flies type catastrophe in order for them to feel in some way, because everything has become digital. And there's a professor, actually, Sherry Tuckle, who talks about how there's been a 40% drop in empathy in young people and college students these days. And I think these kind of stories of the average Joe being able to survive despite these extreme circumstances give us all hope that in the same circumstances we could survive.
Just to jump in quickly, in this tale of overcoming the odds, we have Dave.
Hello.
Hi, Dave.
He's appearing
Hey,
as
Dave.
user, but we do have him.
I can't promise to be here much longer. The laptop keeps cussing out, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, we're very glad to have you while we can.
Okay. I don't get that very often.
On that basis, do you want to make the most of having got out for now? We are just talking through why we write and read about catastrophe. That was a...
Well, I think why we write about it is because it's enormous fun. I find it enormous fun to destroy towns and civilizations. I think reading about it is... We enjoy being frightened. We enjoy being scared, but being able to control it. and this goes all the way back to Homer, I think. You know, there's that thrill of what's the worst possible thing that can happen, and it's entertaining. But it's entertaining when we can close the book and we can put it away and go and have a cup of tea. It's less entertaining when you're sort of sitting in your bedroom and watching this thing happening in real life.
That's the point about control is really interesting, actually, because I think it was ITV had Contagion, the film, on about a week ago, and the internet went a bit mad about it, and opinion seemed completely divided between people who thought this was a dreadful bit of scheduling, and how, you know, how could they possibly think that it was appropriate, and people going, oh, I missed that, I wonder if I can download it, I can get it on Netflix. And I do wonder again whether that's about control. And the people who wanted to watch something that I understand is relatively scientifically sound insofar as fictional depictions of viruses go, in a controlled environment where they can switch off. And the people who felt that it shouldn't have been shown perhaps felt that it was an intrusion into their lives via their television, and they couldn't even have a safe space in their own homes. So that, yeah, I think that's quite an interesting point, like controlling the environment.
There was a book that came out about 10 years ago called The Origin of Stories. I can't remember what the author's name was, but it was applying a kind of a Darwinian perspective to storytelling, given that every single human culture has had storytelling and has sort of had a prominent place in every society. And the one of the arguments that the guy put forward was that stories take the place of play for young animals. You know, how kittens, they're in their play, they're training themselves as predators. They're actually honing the skill set that they will need to survive as adults. The argument is that stories do the same thing for us because they kind of emotionally inoculate us. They allow us to try ourselves out against situations that we haven't yet experienced.
Yeah, I was on the CWA judging panel for a couple of years, and the first year I noticed that a lot of the books were about children being abducted or children being killed, and I thought this was just kind of a bit of a zeitgeisty thing. Maybe it was a fashion. But for the other 2 years as well, it was the same, and I wonder that that's a genuine fear, but it's a fear that's being sort of placed in a way that, you know, people can handle it, people can cope with it. It's
I mean, Dave, it's interesting what you said about fun, really, because I think there is an element of self-satisfaction that comes from it. Maybe, I don't know how much from a reader's perspective, definitely from a writer's perspective, like the element of catharsis when you're trying to explore kicking over the pile of blocks, you know, and seeing what happens. It's the other. I was thinking about this the other day because someone sort of asked me about this on like an interview, and I thought it feels like biting down on a bad tooth. You know, it hurts, but you are stimulating the pain, and you are and getting back to what you guys have been saying about control, you're in control of it, and the pain in that moment actually kind of feels cathartic in the same way that you would if you wrote about, I don't know, like, so I wrote about the worst possible version of a Brexit, like, you know, beyond like the possible, we hope. And I guess it was kind of like a cathartic reaction to the events that I saw on television and in the news that, like, sort of you pointed out, I had no agency and I had no means of controlling it. And I just thought that element, I mean, it's a bit like Fight Club, I guess, in a way. You know, people like I mean, if you ignore the bit about the kind of Project Mayhem and all that, but in Chuck Palahniuk puts forward men fighting each other to try and regain some sense of control over their lives in a way through pain. And I think there's a direct parallel between that. And
I definitely agree with that. The catharsis thing. I can look at any of the books I've written, and the best parts of them for me are the bits that are catharsis in terms of writing. So I mean, Running Club is about the end of the world, running, and kids, and I was obsessing over those three things when I wrote it because I just had kids and I'd discovered running, And I suppose, having the kids made me afraid of catastrophe and you know, those kind of irrational fears you have when you're a new parent. But in writing it, it was like you say, it was testing out those sort of scenarios and seeing how I might have lived through them or survived through them. And I found after writing it, I didn't think about much of those things anymore. So, that's definitely a thing, a catharsis. I'm not sure if that works with the reading. Definitely works with the writing though.
It's massively self-indulgent, isn't it?
Yeah, it's all about us.
So keeping it all about you, Adrian, you mentioned your books there. You wrote about an apocalypse. How did you end the world, and what made you pick that particular manner?
I went through a number of scenarios. The original scenario for the book was going to be nuclear war. So it's going to be a very, very quick ramping up of tensions between countries and then catastrophic nuclear war.
That's quite awkward for running.
Yes, it was. Well, that was the thing, because that brings with it a lot of complications, fallout and radiation and what have you. And I realized I didn't want to deal with complications. And what I realized was that the apocalypse side of it was very, very secondary to the story. I didn't want to have to put the protagonist through the difficult parts of fallout and radiation sickness and what have you. I wanted them to experience their story and you know, their narrative arc and what have you. So I ended up going with asteroids, and then I thought if I did a big asteroid, that's going to have just the same problems as nuclear war. So I'll just do lots of little asteroids to pepper the planet, and that ended up being sufficiently brutal, but with the possibility of life afterwards. So yeah, my choice was made based on having as few complications as possible.
And you chose an apocalypse which is eerily familiar right now. Again, well, insofar as you had a horrible virus, not right now, hopefully. Nonetheless, you wrote about one. So what made you pick that manner?
I could probably say pretty much what he said to Adrian, actually. It didn't start off being about, I didn't start off thinking I'm going to write about a virus. I started off thinking I wanted to write about somebody in a state of extreme isolation, facing the prospect of never being able to make their way home. The reason why it starts on another planet is because if you put somebody in that scenario on our planet, there is always the possibility of making their way home, however difficult it might be. I really needed to be on the other side of space, essentially, for that purpose. And the virus was the mechanism to trigger that scenario. The virus is terribly unscientific. I'm sorry to any very scientific-minded readers. It reduces the people who die from this virus to dust. There is nothing left. And it was a mechanism of convenience. I wasn't writing about a virus per se, so I didn't want to be dealing with the deeply unpleasant after effects of the virus. I wanted to be dealing with isolation and somebody trying to make their way home against insurmountable odds.
That's the beauty of asteroids, you see. Because no one's lived through a multiple asteroid strikes. You can't check the science.
Good point. I'll try to make it more obscure next time.
But fair to say, both of those seem to come back to that point, Mike, that you made at the beginning, that really we write about catastrophes and terrible events to explore the interesting things you can put characters through and the arcs you can explore.
Yeah, I think that's true. My end of the world in Girl with All the Gifts had to be sort of scientifically explicable, because the search for a cure and the cost of a cure was such an enormous part of the story, and of the arc, both of the protagonist and the antagonist. The antagonist in Girl with All the Gifts is a scientist, an idealist in some ways, somebody who's trying to save what's left of the human race from a pathogen that is fungal in nature, one of the many mind-controlling fungi that actually exist in the real world. And she is prepared to sacrifice a whole group of children, infected children who are in her care, in order to synthesize a vaccine. So the story was in effect exploring, well, one of the things it was exploring was the lengths to which we'll go for survival as individuals and as a species, and the question of scientific ethics in the modern era.
So perhaps flipping that around from the more worrying side of scientific ethics, which I think it's fair to say the girls go with all the gifts explores. Looking at the circumstances we're in now, and I mean, here in the UK, we are, I've actually lost track of time. I'm sure I'm not the only one. We are sometime into lockdown or living through very changed circumstances. But generally, our circumstances don't seem to be, so far at least, except for perhaps access to loo roll, as dire as some fiction would suggest. And there's lots of really interesting and supportive things going on at a community level. So is the way this is playing out so far, both on a local and a global level, surprising you? And if so, what aspects have surprised you? Dave, you're still with us.
Yeah. Well, the toilet paper thing surprised me. That was one thing you never see in John Wyndham anything about stockpiling toilet paper. I guess the thing is, I mean, I know there are a lot of people going through a lot of really tough times at the moment, but the thing that strikes me is how mundane all this is. You know, you expect the apocalypse to be Brad Pitt running down the street dressed in an isolation suit to save the world. And the reality is that we're all sitting here swapping bread recipes.
A very British apocalypse.
Very British apocalypse, yeah. It's a kind of little details that I don't think anybody thought of when writing post-apocalyptic or catastrophe fiction, is the kind of how the ordinary people view it. You know, people like us who are just sitting in our rooms, just looking at the world going by. It's not Independence Day. It's more, I don't know, signs. Yeah, I know. You know, NHS workers are going through a terrible time at the moment, and for them it's very different. But I think for the majority of us, it's just sitting here, maybe once a week, going out and doing a shop, bitching about having to queue to get into Tesco's, and that's the apocalypse for most of us. And I don't think, certainly when I've written catastrophe fiction, that's not the kind of little detail I've anticipated.
Yeah, and also the positives. Again, I feel like I have to quantify that by saying it's obviously terrible for the people on the front line, the people that are getting sick. But given the last few years, certainly in Britain, and the news cycles that we've been sort of subjected to, it does feel like a little bit of a tonic in a way. I don't know if anyone else is feeling that, but I mean, this morning we had a social distancing street cup of coffee, 11 a.m. sort of catch up, and I met neighbours I'd never actually met before. As there's a real sense of sort of community building. It feels like there's been a bit of an apocalypse in a way, in terms of its literal meaning, that kind of movement into a new phase of existence. So I certainly wasn't expecting the positives to be quite so pronounced as they are.
So we're sort of seeing society self-repair, aren't we, in some ways? I mean, Britain has been hollowed out by 10 years of austerity. I'm sorry, I don't want to get sort of political in a partisan sense, but we were in our social services, our care services were in a parlous state. And what we're seeing is local communities just creating support networks for themselves to bridge the gaps in state provision. And it's actually been incredibly inspiring, I think, in some ways. Yeah.
It's such a relief not to have everybody talking about Brexit as well. Yeah. Twitter has been remarkably nice for the past couple of weeks.
That won't last.
It's got a lot nicer, hasn't it? It's really, like people are actually genuinely being quite caring, and sort of the messages that I've been seeing have been sort of heartfelt rather than an extended cry for attention, which is what a lot of stuff on Twitter seemed to be previously.
Yeah, and it's actually being used for what it's supposed to be used for, you know, that kind of communication. So yeah.
Yeah, I wonder whether we're actually going to be able to hold on to any of the positives once all this is over, whenever that may be, or whether we're going to immediately forget the apocalypse and go back to doing exactly what we were doing before.
We'll go back to doing what we were doing before, probably.
Well, I'm going to focus on the more hopeful. Hopefully, not everything. This may change many things, and hopefully for the better. But I think I'm a natural optimist. So on that note, Kim, would you say that your work is more an exploration of hope or fear, coming back to our original theme?
Oh gosh,
a bit about why. I mean, the answer may well be.
Yeah, I hate to take things dark again, but I'll start off dark and then hopefully get to the hope. For my work, I wanted to explore the things that were concerning me at the time, which was the rise of the far right and my concerns about my family. My family is a very rainbow family. So I have a trans stepson, a gay daughter, and I was very concerned about the way things were going. And so I created a Saw Earth environment because I wanted that to be stripped bare so that I could concentrate on the reality of human nature and the extremes of human nature and what would happen if people are brought up in the belief system to believe that one set of other people are animalistic and not worthwhile and need to be in concentration camps. And what would happen if somebody who has killed hundreds of thousands of these people is then put into one of those concentration camps and realizes that maybe their entire belief system is wrong and there isn't a difference. And I suppose for me, it was all about this concept of abjection, which is particularly relevant now, I think, to us, because now we're having this circumstance where we're almost scared of each other's bodies, where we are going out in masks and gloves, and we have these spaces between us. And I wonder what occupies that, what is out of the corner of our eyes. This strange sense that other people have become the death bringers. And I'm interested in how that's going to be going forward. But in terms of hope, I've always tried to search for the redemption. And can there be redemption when you come from a place of absolute hate? Or can there be redemption from the current circumstances, as everyone was saying, where it's brought communities together and in a way that probably hasn't happened since the Second World War? And will that continue going forward on a very localized level and in a more organic fashion?
So picking up on that sort of concept of the things that are happening now and having hopes and fears around that. Paddy, you mentioned that you in EchoCycle had written about the worst possible fears you had for Brexit. So would you say that for you betrays a desire to explore fear, or do you push that more into that?
Well, it was weird because I was writing it at a time when it was still open possibility that it wouldn't happen, and you know, it was. I think we were doing the final edits during the last election, so that, which is like the final nail in the coffin sort of anyone who fancied remaining in Europe, and it was interesting because it started out, I guess, with the kind of like, well, this is either going to be oh God, thank goodness we avoided that. That's awful. Or, oh God, this is real now. Unfortunately, it fell down on the side of the real. Fortunately, I don't think that the Brexit future that I wrote about is something that we'll have to suffer through. Well, I hope not. And as I said, it's kind of almost like a deliberate exaggeration in a way, and a kind of partly a cathartic thing, but also an exploration of just extremes and of people that had a kind of separatist rhetoric around the whole thing, and a kind of willful sort of ignoring of the facts and of sort of financial evidence and all these sorts of things. You know, if they really got what they wanted, if they were really given this reversal to the 1950s and the good old days, what would that be like? And that's kind of where I took my jumping off point for that. Yeah, and it was, as I said, it was kind of fun, but then you hit publication date and things have progressed to the point where we did leave, and we're already feeling the after effects of leaving various institutions in Europe, and yeah, it became a little bit more kind of like, oh god, it's a bit uncomfortable now. But yeah, I don't know if I already answered the question there, sorry. But yeah.
It's absolutely fine. Adrian, I'm going to throw this one to you as well. Thankfully, we haven't had to live through any asteroid strikes so far, but what were you exploring? What mood were you trying to push?
Well, I mean, I try and stay on the right side of nihilism because hope is something that I search for when I'm reading fiction. So I wanted that to come through in the books as well. I suppose I'm interested in both fear and hope. I think our species progression is defined by a kind of spiraling of fear and hope and curiosity. Ever since we've crept from the caves. We're scared of the dark, but we're so curious about what's out there that we've actually managed to send nuclear robots to Mars. And that gives us hope for our existence in the future. So I'm interested in how we move from that default state of fear into one of hope, and maybe not with the End of the World Running Club, but with The Last Dog on Earth. That was certainly a key kind of part of the book. I mean, the key protagonist there imposes his own self-isolation in a largely empty city because of his fears and neuroses, but it takes a kind of enforced change to push him into an adventure and out the other side into a state of hope. He sheds his grief and his fears and he becomes a hopeful person. So I think with everything I write, I'm interested in that kind of interplay of fear and hope and how they drive us. But definitely, I wouldn't want to end a book on a nihilistic tone. I don't think I feel satisfied.
It's kind of a responsibility in a way, isn't it, Adrian? I mean,
in a way, yeah.
Yeah, like I guess you set up the worst possible perspective, or the worst possible outcome. But I guess, yeah, you're right. No one really wants to end on a downer, so you have a responsibility to kind of unpick that and come up with an optimistic ending, even if that ending is not a societal one, but just like a personal one. Like someone gets a personal kind of like resolution at the end of it.
I think sometimes the difference between fear and hope is just a matter of perspectives on the same set of events, isn't it? There's a line from, I think it's Reaper Man, one of the early Discworld novels. Pratchett says something was about to happen that was either absolutely wonderful or utterly terrible. It only depended on how close you were standing to it. The end of Go with All the Gifts, I think, is optimistic, but it's not optimistic for humanity. The happy ending is it's a speciation event. It's somebody else who's going to inherit the earth.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to jump in because we're in theory the last 2 minutes of the panel. We've got one question that's been typed in, which the author is happy for us to read. I'm just going to read this out for speed rather than hand over to Anna. Do you feel that post-apocalyptic stories prepare people to deal with possible problems, or make them compare real life events to fictional stories and dismiss real events as this can't possibly be happening? It sounds like a fiction novel. Anyone want to field that one?
I think we like the idea that it prepares us, definitely. I'm channeling my inner Sarah Connor every day at the moment. And, I think the thing is that Sarah Connor starts out as very much a typical final girl trope. But then by the second one, because she's kind of empowered herself so much, there's this idea that, yes, if it actually came down to it, then I could do this too and I could survive. And, she was setting this warrior example way before Zombieland and us all needing to learn how to double tap. So
I think all stories improve your toolkit, your emotional and behavioral toolkit. I think that's one of the things they're for.
We've actually had a couple of other questions in on the Q&A channel. So we've got one from Richard Webb. He asks, do the panelists feel that our fascination with apocalyptic fiction is based in our fear that humankind is inevitably heading towards some kind of moment where society breaks down and ceases to function?
Yes.
Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, I think we've probably always had a sense that something is coming, that things, relatively stable states of affairs, can't last forever. And I think, as has already been said, I think it was Kim who just said, actually, this sense, you get comfort from this sense that, okay, that's really bad. That's a really bad scenario, but I'm totally on top of this. I can ride a horse, rub two sticks together. I'm going to come out of this, so that even if the bulk of the human race doesn't survive, I think we all have a little, probably complete fantasy that we as individuals might be the exception.
Oh, I've got no illusions about that. I'm doomed whatever happens.
Max Brooks, in the book of World War Z, which is a fantastic book,
It
does a great thing on that, about these people getting, 2 crates of tins in their station wagons and driving off into the hills thinking that they'll be fine, and having absolutely no idea that in 2 months' time they're going to be like eating each other, because that's all they've got left.
Yeah.
Just that complete, like, I'm fine. I know exactly what to do. I've got a torch that winds up. I'll be absolutely fine. And it just, the reality, the grim reality. It's almost gleeful, that particular chapter.
I think we're going to have to wrap up. We've gone 1 minute over. So if I hand over to Anna to do the final part of this.
So thank you very much. And I'm very sorry to everyone whose questions we have not managed to get to today. Edmund and Carol, I can see questions still from you in the queue. However, one last question from me as we wrap this up. Someone mentioned zombies and apocalypses in Zombieland just then. So what would your zombie apocalypse plan be in 10 seconds or less?
I'm going to be the guy who goes back to the house to get his car keys and gets eaten before the credit sequence. That's my plan. I'll
be fine. My daughter likes whittling sticks. This is a zombie killing stick. She's got about 5 or 6 of these. So we're going to be fine.
I think for me, a good pair of running shoes. I don't have to outrun the zombies. I just have to outrun everybody else.
I'll be heading north, as the character in my book did. We have a constant thing in this house, argument in this household about who could survive the zombie apocalypse the longest. I'll be going north. My partner will be heading south. Must divvy the children up somehow.
I have a baseball bat.
Yeah, I've got a katana upstairs. That'll probably go out fighting.
Okay, I'm going to have to wrap this up now. So if everybody can try as quickly as they can to get into the meeting, I will see you there in about 30 seconds, hopefully. Thank you. I'm going to hit the end button now.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.